Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have a great show for you tonight. We're going to forego our usual hemp news segment, and we have Chris Lindsey, who is a national activist here in the United States, working for the Marijuana Policy Project, working in Montana, in Illinois, and starting the new U.S. Cannabis Council. So stay tuned for an interesting show. And if you or a loved one, though, are looking for a doctor to help you get a medical marijuana permit, we have a national referral service. We'll be happy to find a good doctor in your area to help you. Just give us a call at 503-235-4606. That's 503-235-4606. Stay tuned for our interview with Chris Lindsey and help us restore hemp. Good night.
I feel the force.
I'd like to introduce a longtime friend and associate, brother in arms in the cannabis movement, who I have known for about 15 years now, who is based in Montana, but has also worked for the Marijuana Policy Project, the DC-based marijuana policy group, and is now working with the U.S. Cannabis Council. And been an attorney, and it's good to have you on the show and see you, Chris.
It's been a while, Paul. It's a real thrill actually to catch up after all this time. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion here today and just talking about all the stuff. I mean, it must be going on 8 years, maybe even longer than that now. But it's been quite a while. So happy to see where do you want to begin? How do we even start?
When we first met, I remember I came to Missoula, Montana, and rented a hotel conference and brought in doctors, Dr. Orvald and Dr. Eric Eisenbud, who had been licensed in other states, and we started seeing medical marijuana patients, and right. That's where you and a number of other people I got to meet and get kind of involved in Montana politics. And you're still based in Montana.
Yeah, that's
today.
right. I still live in Montana, and now that you've pinpointed that, that means that we probably go back to 2009. That's probably when we met, and it would have been that summer because it was your clinics. You had established really what got copied quite a bit all throughout
the country. It's corrupted if we go and talk about
Jason
right.
Well, and that corrupted is probably a good term for it. I mean, that's
exactly term. It was, and that I think led to so many bad things.
It really, to this day, I believe that was more than anything else what turned voters and then emboldened law enforcement to crack down on cannabis in our state.
And for our viewers who don't understand what we're talking about, which is everybody probably, when I first came into a various state, and Montana was probably about the fifth state that I opened up medical marijuana physician services in, we would get medical records on patients. We had protocols that we followed to make certain we met the requirements of the state. And so we would require the patients to send us their medical records, and we would review those medical records to make certain they had documentation of a qualifying condition. Then they would come in and we would give them a little education session about the marijuana laws and about how to grow marijuana if that's what they want to do. Then they would meet with a doctor who would do a physical exam and take their blood pressure and pulse and a little interview for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then write up the documentation that went to the Montana Health Authority. And that's the protocol we followed so that we didn't run afoul for our physicians if any, medical malpractice or medical ethical case came up.
That's right.
But this fellow named Jason Christ came to our first clinic, and remember, he had holes in his shoe and he had this car that was bellowing smoke. And he pretty much turned the process on his head and got doctors to sign stacks of marijuana forms and would line up 1,000 patients a day in line to get their medical marijuana card. And they would just come in and they'd write their name in and give it to them. There was no process involved except handing out the cards. And that led to the backlash in Montana. There were a lot of different dispensaries opening up across the state as well that became the focal points of the crackdown. Just so our audience understands what I mean by how this fellow Jason Christ corrupted the medical marijuana law of Montana. And I operated in a dozen different states, and he's the only one that ever did that.
Yeah, that was definitely an extreme example. So this is back in the olden days when you couldn't find a doctor. Like you had the program and you knew it existed, and you heard about some guy who maybe pulled a card out somewhere, but getting to a doctor, much less getting your own doctor to sign these forms, was really, really difficult. So when you came in, the service that you offered was really important. I mean, because it was a lifeline for patients all around the state, and people worked pretty hard to make sure they could get your forms. And this was a real serious, kind of effort. And Jason got, a look at basically your operation and copied it and did the absolute fast food version of it, and unfortunately got headlines. And he would go to hotels where he would have just literally hundreds of people packed into the lobbies, queued up for the fastest possible doctor's visit, and unfortunately opponents very quickly.
A little TV screen with some guy in Tennessee.
Yeah. So what happened was he burned bridges with his doctors, and so nobody that was actually really in Montana wanted to participate. And so he did the telemedicine thing, and it unfortunately became just ammunition for our opponents, and it really undermined, I think, the long term, because it set up for a lot of law enforcement activity at that point.
So you are an attorney, and so I remember you were involved with, I don't want to get people's names wrong. There was Tom B.
There was Tom Dobert.
Yeah,
and, right.
And Floor, I don't know. And
Floor.
You all got caught up in a federal sting or something, right?
Yeah. So what happened? And then Chris Williams. And we were the sort of original partners of one of the businesses, but understand that many businesses were impacted. So this wasn't just like but what happened was,
how many different businesses did they attack at that time? This federal effort to go into all the dispensaries in the state.
Not all of them, but by my last count, it was 28 businesses were raided within about a 2-hour period. And that was a huge percentage of the businesses in the state. So, we were seeing raids in California that paled in comparison by raw numbers, but in a relatively small community like Montana, everybody kind of knew each other. this was like, an atom bomb going off. So what happened was, our summer, here are the clinics, here come the clinic copies. And, we saw in terms of patient numbers, this hockey stick of growth, right? So it's like this for years and years and years. And then here comes the summer of 2009, and it's just like this. And that freaked everybody out, and suddenly that turned things around. So I had basically a split with the partners after about 9 months. We just wanted to get different things out of the business. We had different visions. I was kind of a lawyer and was kind of happy being a lawyer. And so I decided, you know what, I'll just go back into private practice, but and I wanted to focus on cannabis at that point, rather than, I had been doing criminal defense work and other stuff before that. So I was kind of like, you know what, I'll just go do this other thing. And so that's what I did for about a year and a half. And then that's when the raids happened. So DEA and state law enforcement and got together and raided all these businesses, and including the one that I helped start. So the way that federal law works is, if you help start something that becomes a criminal, act, and then you don't do something to help prevent it, even if you quit and bail and you're out, you're still on the hook for anything that comes from it. And a good example is if you and I decided to rob a bank, and I helped plan it, and even help buy, let's go get a car and stuff like that, and then I decide I don't want to see through it, but you do, right? I'm actually still on the hook, and that's the way these kind of criminal proceedings work. So I was immediately charged as a co-conspirator, and brought up on all the same charges as the guys who were still part of the organization, which was Tom and the other guys.
Growing and helping a local dispensary, or what were they charged with? I remember Tom.
Yeah,
he came to a lot of our clinics as we.
Yeah, there were
introduced people to the local community. I tried to tie in to, the local activists. People I thought were legitimate, including you and Tom.
Yeah. Well, he certainly was, and the other guys were too. I think we were all more or less hit with the same charges. So, and it was possession with intent to distribute. It was actual distribution, and then there was production. So they take each sort of part of this activity of growing and selling, and then they sort of stack up a bunch of offenses, and then they all have mandatory minimums, and then there were firearms at the facility, and so that just turns everything into a complete. Everything that was bad is now really bad, and so effectively, what came of it, I think we ended up with about 5 or 6 charges each. And then the mandatory minimums on them came to 87 years. So the maximums were, in the hundreds of years. It was ridiculous. But the mandatory minimums alone were a life sentence.
So that was stacked consecutively, not concurrently.
Yeah, I don't think they do concurrent. Maybe they do in the federal system, but that was never on the table. I'm not kidding. The prosecuting attorney literally told my counsel that I would not leave prison except in a pine box. I mean, literally, I got the pine wood box.
And that happened to one of your co-defendants.
Yeah. So Richard Floor was very ill and on quite a few meds that he needed, and of course, the entire episode for him was horrifying, and so he's taken into custody.
His wife as well. And were there other family members that he had? I think they went after his whole family.
Yeah, they went after his whole family. He was in the eastern part of the state, and so really kind of fell into a different. He had a different court and a different judge than sort of the folks on the western side of the state. And so they threw him in, and he was incarcerated, I think, for the duration, and got sick and got worse throughout. And at a certain point,
being transported from Montana to some other federal prison, chained to a bed in the Las Vegas jail, he passed away.
I didn't remember Las Vegas, but yes, I mean, I think everything that you said is what I recall, that he had taken in, and they effectively had, what I understood is that he had taken him completely off of his medication, and that he was in bed, and that he had rolled out of bed, and that somehow had led to his death. Whether, I don't know exactly what had happened, but I mean, it's horrifying. No matter what it was just an absolute shock and an outrage. And, the whole thing, there was so much harm that really came from all of it. But for this is something that I do talk to people about today, and that's that if your job is strictly medical cannabis, and you operate a pretty small business, relative to what we see a lot of these businesses doing today, you have a very personal relationship with people who are very, very sick. And you actually, and in Montana, if you ran out of cannabis, your patient was screwed. I mean, they couldn't go to another caregiver, not legally. And they probably did, but these are really, really sick people. They shouldn't have to be calling around to find out where they can score a bag. And so there was a tremendous amount of pressure to try to deliver for these people that in ways that I hadn't expected. I mean, when I started, it was like, oh, hey, this is a business we could probably do well with. And I had experience running businesses before, and we're seeing a new level of sophistication. It was kind of this would be a thing we could do and be effective at it. But when we actually got in it, it really transformed into something much different than that. And so when you get charged with this stuff, when you have suddenly law enforcement now leveling accusations at you, it takes on a much different character. I mean, if I had done something awful, and now I am being exposed in public because now I'm being charged, I could see that being a pretty horrible experience for somebody to go through. But to be charged by the federal government for mass producing cannabis to help or to sell to, consumers, I was actually very proud of that work, So it's much different than sort of being caught, I was busted. Oh no. It's like, yeah, I was on the front page of the paper, very proud of the work that we did to help very sick people manage, very serious illness. So F you guys, and there, it just was a much different flavor, I think, going through that process. Now, not to say that it wasn't absolutely serious, because obviously it was, and for most of that time, I expected to spend the next decade and a half to 2 decades in jail, just because that stacking, even the best case scenario, you can only get it down so far, and so
if you know it, but I went through a federal trial in 1993, where if I had been convicted, I would have had a 10-year mandatory minimum. But I was fortunate jury nullification. When I wrote an article about it that's been republished in the FIJA, or the Fully Informed Jurors Act People's Newsletter. I think they're in Bozeman there.
They are.
Ashley are in Montana. But I helped a lot of different people navigate those court proceedings. Several followed in my footsteps. Most people did not, given the incredible psychological toll of facing down the federal government going to trial. I can understand why people don't.
Well, in our case, the prosecutors worked very hard and got basically, the technical term is they got motions in limine in very early that were very broad. But the less technical way is to say that they really closed a lot of the avenues that FIJA would have normally, I think, had available, and made it extraordinarily difficult for anybody to do anything.
In my case, the prosecutor introduced my library, and my library included about 20 books, most of them autographed. One of them was called Marijuana, Your Legal Rights. And so as soon as my defense attorney got a chance to cross-examine, he told the young long-haired cop who testified all morning, pick up that, and we didn't call any witnesses, by the way, but pick up that book, Marijuana, Your Legal Rights, and read the chapter headline. The chapter headline was, jurors can acquit defendants even if they think they're guilty. And the whole chapter about, and so of course the federal assistant U.S. Attorney jumps up, no, objection, he can't say that. Judge, no. You introduced this evidence. So I had a good judge there at the trial.
Yeah.
This evidence. And you can't object to your own evidence. And so it's one of the saving graces of my trial. If you want more info, just go look up how FIJA saved my life. That's the article. It'll pull it up in more detail than I can recall right now.
Yeah. Well, I had several lucky breaks in my case.
Yeah.
One of them was that the prosecuting attorneys were not familiar with this judge. And so I think didn't expect that he would go his own way on sentencing. Very often a prosecuting attorney kind of has a sense of where the range is and what they think a judge will likely do. And so when they go in, they'll say, Judge, this is what we think. And especially if they're working any sort of plea agreements, then there's a bit of a crystal balling that happens where the two sides will sort of say, well, we can work out a deal between us. And in my case, it was basically just to agree, I'm not going to go to trial. I'm just going to agree that I did the things that you say I did. Once you're to that point, though, you have to go in front of the judge and say, hey, Judge, back in the day, I said not guilty. I'm actually now going to say I am guilty, but I'm going to do it because we've worked out a deal with this other lawyer, right? And so there's this weird kind of process that happens in almost every case, by the way, more than 95%.
Yeah, and that empowers the prosecutor more than it takes the power away from the judge and gives it to the prosecutor.
There are two flavors, and one of them does take the power away from the judge. The other one does not, and it just depends on the way that the judges like to operate and all that kind of stuff. But effectively what happened was the prosecutors kind of flew on the expectation that they were going to get a certain response from the judge, that he would basically say, yep, that's kind of, that they were all going to be more or less on the same page. And they were not. And because I think first of all, they didn't know really where the judge's thoughts were on this because he was a brand new judge. But they also, this judge had the opportunity to hear all the things that we had tried to do up to the point where I agreed to plea, right? Because we tried everything, right? All the pretrial, because this was early. We hadn't seen cases yet on, okay, does this violate the due process guarantees? Are there interstate arguments? Are there, you had Eric Holder that had said we weren't going to do this stuff anymore, and then here we are. We had all these things that had still really not been fully fleshed out in court, and we did that. So the judge had seen all this, and unfortunately under federal law, you just lose across the board. Just one thing after another. You try it, no. And the federal government holds most of the cards in these kind of proceedings. And so you go in really at a huge disadvantage. So, one after another went by, but by the time we got to the plea and the plea agreement and the judge sitting there thinking about what he's going to do, he had heard everything and heard the lengths to which we had gone to try to operate within the limits of a very vague law. Like that was really fundamentally the problem, was that Montana's law wasn't really fully formed. There were a lot of inconsistencies. You really could not comply with the law because it was not really sound. And where other state legislatures had gone in and sort of fine-tuned this stuff, Montana's legislature had never done that. And so we just sort of persisted with this kind of semi-defined system. And it was real easy for the federal government to come in and say, oh, well, look at all the things you were doing. We don't see where the state law allowed that. And they were right. But it doesn't mean it was just. It just means that, okay, yeah, you're right. It doesn't say that you can actually do that. But if you're going to be doing this at all, you kind of have to do that. And those sorts of arguments don't mean anything when you're in a criminal proceeding. So, that sort of left us without much to do but plead guilty, because there wasn't anything to deny. What a jury does is what's called find facts, right? Which is to figure out, did you stab the person? Did you rob the bank? I grew lots and lots of marijuana plants, and I dried them and I smoked them myself, and I provided them to sick people. So there really wasn't a debate about whether I wasn't going to go in and act like I hadn't. So at that point, you plead out. And so here we are pleading out. Now, Tom went first in terms of our order. So he got up and did the whole thing, and he.
So you all sentenced at the same time, or were you?
There was I think it was about 3 weeks between us, but Tom and I were in exactly the same situation. There's a requirement under federal law that if they try to do what's called similarly situated defendants. So meaning that we really were in just as far to the organization. We had the same criminal histories. There really wasn't much to distinguish us when you come down to the things they look at for sentencing. And so what happened to Tom was going to happen to me. So Tom went first. And I'm basically sitting, a couple rows back. And we had no idea what was going to happen. The prosecutor was asking for 6 years jail. Tom was looking for no time at all. And my lawyer thought that was a little crazy. That just going in, I was shooting for the moon, and you want to be somewhere within the realm of possibility here, that kind of thing. And so I'm sitting in the back kind of white knuckling it, because I know pretty much whatever Tom's going to get is what I'm going to get about 3 weeks. And so they went through the whole thing, and the prosecutor gave, I think went first and said, here's the reality of the situation, and sort of made this, they grew and did all these horrible things, and made the case, and then said why they thought we should get 6 years. And it was because you've got in the federal system, they've got really strict, basically charts, right? And so you look at the chart, and we're like 15 years. I mean, that's so we'll go with half that, and better than half that for 6, kind of. I think, doing the math there, I don't know, but that seemed to be more or less what it was. And then Tom and his attorney went, and they made the case for why they thought he shouldn't do any time. And that's basically that, look, we did everything we could to be Boy Scouts here. This was every single step. We were trying to be the best operating procedures in light of the law that we could. And when
I thought you did. That organization was one of the best in the state, in my opinion.
And we sort of made a thing of it, and we expected to try, because we had been lobbying previously. We figured we were going to go back and talk to lawmakers and sort of have this heart-to-heart about, here's what you need to do if you want to regulate effectively, and it was really naive in retrospect, but that's kind of what we were thinking. So, I forget where we were. Oh, so sentencing. And so Tom goes through his side, And then the judge basically goes on about it felt like 45 minutes, just lays the whole thing out, just says, well, and we had testimony on this, and he had done clearly a massive amount of research and consideration, because before, he's a guy in a black dress sitting up on the podium, right?
Was he an Obama appointee?
I'm not sure if he was, because I think he was already impaneled. I don't know, actually. I can't say. I don't remember.
Okay.
But nonetheless, we're really hearing from him. Hmm?
What's his name?
Judge Christensen.
Okay.
And so but he's very carefully gone through this stuff, and he's not just taking what the prosecutor said, but certainly heard what the prosecutor said. And it went on, but the net result of it was, no, I'm not going to give this guy jail. I'm going to give him 5 years probation. And so it went from, you're not going to prison for, 6 years at that, it was sort of like, okay, now they're asking for 6 years. We know that's probably the ceiling. So 6 years. And now it's 5 years probation, which was like an absolute, it was not expected. Deb did not expect, we expected 2 years prison, because that was kind of what everybody was getting. That was sort of I think there was somewhere between 1 year and 2 years for the folks that got swept up in that, and then were actually brought charges and all the rest. So it was a big shock.
So that must have changed your attorney's idea on what to because your involvement was even less than Tom was actually there running the operation.
Yeah, he was still there at the business as one of the owners running it when the raid occurred. I was out by a year and a half, but honestly, I don't think the prosecutors, they didn't treat that as enough of any difference. And maybe but in practical terms,
the judge realized that you folks really had been the Boy Scouts of the, so to speak, of the burgeoning industry there at the time.
Right.
Gave you an unusual sentence, to say the least.
Yep. So that was just it was the fact that we had this unknown judge. It was the fact that the prosecutor, I mentioned before when we were chatting that there's sort of the two ways you can do plea agreements. He did the one without takebacks. So in other words, if he says what he wants and the judge doesn't go with it, he doesn't get to say, oops, I'm taking that back, we're going to trial. He's actually lost his ability at that point if the judge doesn't go with him, and that's exactly what happened. So the rug got pulled right out from under him in the sentencing when Tom was up. And being similarly situated is what informed my attorney. I didn't quite know what that meant, right? I'm just like, wow, good for Tom. But by the time we got out of there, my attorney's like, you're going to get the same deal. And then later he explained, what that meant. But so by that point, then
being on federal probation is no picnic at the beach or anything.
No. I random P tested every week for 5 years.
Yeah, I know what I went through the pre-trial, even though I didn't, get sentenced to the federal. I had to call in every day, and if they'd say what color it was, and if my color came up, at first I had to go every few days, every 2 or 3 days, and it gradually, it was about a 6-month period before a trial that I went through.
No, it was the same thing, but mine was 5 years.
Yeah.
Big pain in the butt, I can tell you. And it's so funny because the places where they set up to do those tests are in the sleaziest hotels in town. And so here's a bunch of sort of shady looking characters all showing up to go to a hotel room in the middle of the day in the sketchiest part of town. And I can't imagine what that looked like. I mean,
wow.
What a joke. Here's the federal justice system at work.
Yeah, here in Portland, I live in Portland, and they're here, so they didn't have to go rent a hotel room to piss test us.
Yeah, no, I don't know why, but there we were. So yeah. So, but what happened in terms of my whole career path at that point, obviously, was pulled out of the fire. But my
Yeah.
law practice was over because at the minute that I had maintained my practice, everybody knew what was going on.
Sure.
And so I had continued to represent folks in different cases around the state. But as soon as I pled guilty, then that triggered a requirement under the state ethics that said if you're a felon, you can't be practicing law without review, right? That's just a basic rule, and I frankly don't question it. And so that immediately triggered a suspension of my license. Now, once they had reviewed it, they restored my license. And so that really was never a long term, but during that 6-month period, I mean, effectively my practice had ended. I had to notify all my clients, notify all the courts, which is, great fun. And basically just saying, yeah.
Right.
If you hadn't seen the paper, hi, I'm Chris, here's the situation. So that, and starting back up again, in those circumstances, it's not the best time to open a law office. So fortunately for me, Marijuana Policy Project was hiring, and I started working for them, and it was a godsend, and it gave me a place to sort of take all the frustration and rage and that had developed through this whole process and gave me a place. And there were several things. I mentioned that there were several really lucky breaks that I got throughout that whole process. And one of them was the way that who the judge was, and the way that that whole part of it was. And one of the ways was the fact that I had a probation officer who recognized that the work I did was a First Amendment right, and that he was willing to let me continue the advocacy parts as long as I wasn't, hands on the plant. So I wasn't running a business or in any way sort of putting illicit activity, right? I wasn't generating any of that, but I certainly could talk to people about sensible policy and the need to change our laws. And so I basically did my entire probation period at MPP, and then for years after that. So
Yeah. What was your career? What year did you start with MPP? And I know I read something, I guess it was last February or so, where you were still speaking on behalf of MPP.
Yeah. So what happened, I believe that was April of 2012 is when sentencing happened. I think it happened a few months earlier, and that April was when I think I started at Marijuana Policy Project.
Okay.
And so and I was a state working in the state basically state lobbying, and because MPP does its work two ways. They're the ones that are out there, trying to legalize, trying to do the big, shift. Let's get medical cannabis, or let's legalize the state.
Yeah. 2012 was an auspicious year in terms of U.S. cannabis policy. We'll get to that in a minute. But so you worked from them from then until recently?
Till even today. Because what happened, here's what happened. So MPP had been very active and continues to be very active in different states. And I had been in one of them. In one of the first states I had been assigned when I started at MPP in 2012 was Illinois. And Illinois' legislature was then considering medical cannabis. And having sort of been in the thick of it the whole time, I was just sort of like, whoop, you could just sort of drop me in. And as long as I wasn't making rookie mistakes, all was well. And fortunately, I had just about the best mentor you could possibly have in the cannabis space. It's the absolutely underappreciated Karen O'Keefe. And anybody who's been in the space for very long should know that name. And she's hopefully going to be recognized as one of the reasons of the United States is adopting legalization. I mean, flat out. She has minted more of the people out there in the world right now, and done her own work, and without any, never sought the limelight. And so here I am. I thought I was a hot, somewhat hot shot. I knew, cannabis, and I'm a go-to kind of guy. Working for Karen humbled me in a lot of ways, and I worked for years for her before I felt really confident in really representing this issue.
Is she still in with MPP in DC?
Yep, she is still very much an active part, and did a lot of the work in Pennsylvania recently, and all of that. But I got thrown in as sort of assigned to the state where she oversees the department, and so basically watched, because so much had happened by that time. I watched it go across the medical cannabis law go across the finish line with the legislature in Illinois, and then was around for the rulemaking. So tried to, that was where I really started, was that, and then started developing relationships, and worked with 2 lawmakers in the state, a senator and a representative, to try to work on decriminalization. So let's just stop, up to, I think it was 10 grams is what it was. And then, but what was really important was, not only working with those amazing people, but it was also creating the tracks for expungement, because expungement, most people, sort of think, yes, expungement, and we kind of have a sense of what it is, but it really doesn't exist in most state legal systems, and you have to create it while you're legalizing, and that's hard, and so and then we're going to make it automatic, and we're going to make it free. And so you create a huge challenge for yourself. So having the ability to sort of do that through the decriminalization law that happened in Illinois, then set the stage for legalization, which was, of course, the show with the same sponsors and the same team that did decriminalization, that then got to do legalization, which was absolutely the pride and joy of my life, to work with those folks at that time and moment in history with the people, even in government people were amazing. So it was just, it was a real moment for me.
So you're talking about the Illinois legalization, and that was done by the legislature, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the first state that had adopted a full regulatory legalization system, like we had seen, Oregon had adopted those many years before. Now it's lawmakers in the Midwest actually coming up with a system. Now the system had a lot of issues. When lawmakers pass these things, they look a lot different than when voters do. But at any rate, it was still a moment.
Illinois has, a checkered history from the Daley dynasty in Chicago to Blagojevich that Trump just pardoned last year.
Yeah, that guy. Sure, Illinois has its history, but I'd say for the most part, the law has worked effectively. The biggest problems with it are not things like graft. It's not like, oh, this was now the mob owns the medical cannabis, like that kind of stuff didn't happen. The issue is that there is no representation for small and minority-owned businesses, and that is its own. We need to have our own special episode on just how complicated that problem is and the different efforts out there to try to remedy it. But legalization, that bill, and those sponsors in particular, became a huge opportunity to see how far can we go towards trying to create as many on-ramps as possible for people who are trying to get in this, who've been impacted by the war, or are people of color, which really is kind of 2 different groups, but there's a big overlap. So Illinois was sort of postgraduate school for me of that entire period at MPP, and then got to sort of see all 3 of those pieces of legislation get across the finish line. And then what happened was more and more activity. The middle part, and not to get too far down in the details here, but the Illinois experience came at a time when MPP was undergoing a lot of change. And what had happened was the early years for MPP, it was rich philanthropists who paid the bills. It was George Soros's of the world. And that's great.
Well, that's where I should just jump in here and say about 2012 in particular, because I have my own insight, as I'm sure you can imagine, about 2012. I'd been working on marijuana politics going back to the 70s, worked on the second marijuana vote in the United States in 1986 here in Oregon, the first being in 1972 in California. But in 2012, from my perspective, it was kind of like a competition between the DPA and the MPP. And the MPP had Colorado, and it was MPP that funded putting the initiative on the ballot in the state of Colorado, where the Drug Policy Alliance funded putting the initiative on the ballot in Washington. And pretty much I and our clinics funded putting the initiative on the ballot in Oregon, even though MPP and DPA really didn't want us to do it, And DPA
because it wasn't a presidential election, was it, or was it? I don't remember now.
Yeah, it was 2012. It was it was definitely a presidential election year.
All right,
So it was Obama's second term. And
same time as Alaska.
Yeah, it was the same time as Colorado and Washington. We were the three on there in 2012. Okay. Alaska, I think, was along with California the following in 2014. We actually lost. I put it on the ballot and lost with 47% of the vote. And DPA tried to push us out of the picture, but we made the ballot. They couldn't really stop us then, but they didn't talk nice about us. Let's just say that. They actually came in and pushed us out of the way for 2014. And I won't go into all those details. You'll have to read the book someday. But I did support the initiative once it made the ballot. I was competing with it up to then. And some of the people within DPA, I won't name names like Nadelman or Graham Boyd. I wouldn't do that. But they came in and basically arranged a corporate ripoff that took my business away from me. And now my business is on the Toronto Stock Exchange, valued at $500 million. And I have about $4,000 worth of stock in that. But
well, I hope you do write a book on that, because that's a very interesting story that I did not know.
yeah, there's a whole bunch of different ones that are pretty interesting, but that's one of them. And so, and my producer, Bill, also was ripped off. They tried to get this show taken off the air. They contacted our cable system here in Portland and told them I am a racist and other bad things. But the people on the cable system know me, and they didn't think very nicely of the attorney who wrote that letter. But anyway, yeah, they spent $2 million on attorneys using the most expensive firm in the state that's aligned with Nike and Intel and the Democratic Party. And the judges always ruled in their favor, so I demanded a jury trial. I spent $170,000 in the first 6 months on attorneys and went broke. And so for the next 2.5 years, I represented myself. A week before my demanded jury trial, they wanted it to go before a judge. And as I think I told you about my previous jury nullification case, I've never lost with the jury, but they dismissed their case. So all of their injunctions went away, but the only way I can get my business back is to go hire a bunch of lawyers and sue them. And now those people are in bed with Marlboro Tobacco and Altria. They're the board of directors of the Kronos Group. in Toronto. But anyway, there's more to that. Enough of that. So now that's my take on the 2012 election. But I am happy to see the law being implemented here in Oregon, and now, you know, it's happening nationwide. How did it work out in Montana?
So MPP has both lanes, right? The lobbying side and the ballot initiative side, and continued to do that work, and had been sort of rolling merrily along, largely from presidential election to presidential election. You know, every now and then you'd have somebody want to do one in an off season, but generally speaking, the conventional wisdom was stick to the presidentials. You can have more voters, and more voters is good for us. So Montana happened to be a voter initiative state, and it also happens to be a pretty cheap date as these things go.
All state, so you don't need that many signatures.
Don't need a
lot. And is in Oregon too.
Right. Now it does have some challenges. It's widely, this population is spread thin, right? And you have to hit a certain number in every county and all this. But if you're in the business of gathering signatures for political campaigns, this isn't a heavy lift. And so we initiated a campaign, and it was looking very, very promising. And so there were several. This was going to actually be a record year for the number of simultaneous voter initiatives. I had them up on my whiteboard. I wouldn't even hazard now to try to guess my way through it, but it was a bunch, probably like 6. And then COVID. And suddenly, so a couple of states had already been gathering, and Arizona had been one of them. I can't think of the other, but it was another one. Or they were close enough that we expected they were going to be able to complete. We weren't directly affiliated with Arizona, by the way. That was the first successful, basically company-backed, just flat out company-backed, voter initiative that worked. I mean, it wasn't terrible. It wasn't, it didn't build constitutional protections forever for your personal farm or whatever, that kind of stuff. But anyway, we started one up in Montana, and Montana was sort of at the same time as South Dakota. So now you have the prospect of saying, here are red states now, not just New Jersey, not just, California, but Montana and South Dakota. We've already seen Oklahoma. That was really helpful in a lot of ways. And so even though what happened was COVID hit, Montana was still pretty early in the process, but because other states shut down, it allowed us to reevaluate, okay, with the money that remains, where can we get the biggest bang? And it was, Montana. So, because we had already started. So that's when Matt Schweik kind of continued. And I mean, we had pens wrapped in cellophane and gloves and masks. I mean, it was at the height of the scare. This was March and April and May, when all of a sudden we realized that our kids were not going to go back to school. And
but so they actually, you won in Montana, and it's been kind of back and forth in terms of finally rolling out the system, right?
Yep. Yeah.
We're down now, I think, to about 4 minutes. We're going to go to a full hour show here, and we'll have to have you back on in the future. So where does it sit today in like 1 minute or less?
1 minute or less. We are waiting on state regulators in Montana to produce their proposed rules, and there'll be comments. We think that the licensing should start in October. And the first sales for adult consumers in shops, proudly walking in and slapping down your driver's license, should be in January. So looking forward to seeing that.
So tell me about your work with this U.S. Cannabis Council. What can you say about that in a minute or less?
Yeah, so Marijuana Policy Project agreed with a lot of other organizations and businesses that we really need to come together in DC and begin to speak with one voice. If we don't do that, then DC will decide for us. So Marijuana Policy Project helped launch the U.S. Cannabis Council, and I'm on loan. So I actually wear two hats. I'm the Vice President of Policy at the U.S. Cannabis Council, and I'm very proud to do that work in DC. And then my other hat is at Marijuana Policy Project, and I lend a hand wherever it makes sense to do so. So yeah, that's life today.
That's exciting. Well, we'll definitely have to have you back on more often in the future, because you're a font of information here. I'm just fascinated by it, being a cannabis policy legalization junkie that I am.
Yeah. Well, we can nerd out all afternoon one of these days, Paul.
That sounds fun. I'd like an opportunity to get up into Montana, and if you're ever down here in Portland, feel free to look me up.
I would love to do so, actually. I do mean to take you up on that.
Good. So if anybody's interested in reaching out, do you want to give a contact at MPP or the U.S. Cannabis Council, or just you personally, in terms of
Sure. Yeah, I would just probably, because I'm where my eyeballs are the most right now is in my email at the U.S. Cannabis Council. So that would be Lindsey, CLINDSEY at uscannabiscouncil.org.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. We'll be talking more in the future. I've had Chris Lindsey on, and we'll have more here soon.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
And whatever's going on in this dimensional reality, we'll never outfight them. It's about outthinking them. It's about outthinking them. Just think about that, right? About outthinking them. Alternative energy, power, alternative energy, conscious live thought, the process of thinking, energy. We are the alternative energy that can make the change to happen. But we really have to understand what this means. We really have to get it and understand it, then we become that power. The power of the people doesn't have shit to do with the vote or any other thing. It's got to do with thinking with a clear, coherent, intelligent mind. Use the intelligence clearly and coherently. How much power do we have? Can you make yourself feel miserable with your fears and your doubts and your insecurities? If you can do that, you have power. Simply put. All right? So it's just a matter, but that's power used incoherently and chaotically. So just think, some mental shifts here, and use that power clearly and coherently, and real change. This is the power of the people. Like this Cannabis Tax Act, you vote, but the voting is like using it as a tool. You just use it as a tool, but your power isn't there. Your power isn't here.